Hey there and welcome back. We're diving into something today that could really have a big impact on students all over the country. It's the potential dismantling of the U.S. Department of Education. You probably heard a lot about this already, right? Some strong opinions on both sides, for sure. So we're going to break down exactly what the department does, why some folks want to get rid of it, and what could happen if it actually disappears.
This isn't just some kind of theoretical debate. It's a real thing. Donald Trump has said he wants to eliminate the Department of Education, straight up eliminate it. And yet just a few weeks ago, on January 20th, 2025, he oversaw the confirmation of Linda McMahon as the new education secretary.
And that's right. So on one hand, we've got Trump calling for the department to be shut down. He's even used the word immediately. And on the other hand, he's appointing someone to lead it. So what's the deal with that?
Well, I think to understand that, you got to look at Trump's core belief that education should be handled by individual states, not the federal government. It's this whole send education back to the states idea, which is a big part of his platform.
So is this a case of actions speak louder than words? This is kind of confusing to appoint someone to lead a department you're actively trying to get rid of.
Yeah, it definitely raises some eyebrows. But it also highlights something important. You can't just eliminate a federal agency like that. It takes congressional approval, and right now it's not a sure thing. So even if Trump wants it gone immediately, he can't just make it so.
Right, and McMahon herself acknowledged this at her confirmation hearing, right? She said the department can't be shut down without Congress, so there are some checks and balances at play. But hasn't Trump shrunk other agencies during his time in office?
Absolutely. Take USAID, for example. That agency went through some serious downsizing and program cuts under Trump. So even if he can't fully dismantle the Department of Education, he could try to significantly reduce its power and reach.
Okay, so let's say, hypothetically, the department were to be dismantled. What would we actually be talking about? What does the Department of Education even do?
Most people probably don't realize just how much the department is involved in. A lot of people think student loans. And that is a huge piece of the puzzle. We're talking about a portfolio of $1.7 trillion in student loans with over 40 million borrowers.
Whoa, okay, that's a lot. So what does the department actually do with all those loans?
So they work through an office called the Federal Student Aid Office, or FSA. It's through the FSA that the department works with companies that service those loans. They handle things like repayment plans and oversee a bunch of programs designed to help borrowers, including one specifically for people in public service jobs called the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, or PSLF for short.
Got it, PSLF. But it's not just managing existing loans, is it? The department is also involved in getting that money to students in the first place, right?
You got it. Remember the FSI? That big financial aid application everyone fills out for college? Well, the department is responsible for that, as well as for distributing Pell Grants, which help lower and middle-income students afford college.
Okay, so we've got the student loan side of things, but the department also manages grants for public schools themselves, right? Things like Title I funding, which is so important for schools in lower-income communities.
Exactly. Title I provides a lot of resources to schools that serve a large number of students from low-income families, giving them extra support to help those students succeed. And we can't forget about funding for students with disabilities, which also comes from the department.
Wow, so even without student loans, we're talking about a massive amount of money and resources flowing through the Department of Education to schools all over the country.
Right. And while some people have suggested moving all these responsibilities to other agencies, like maybe putting student loans under the Treasury Department, experts say that would be incredibly complicated. These programs are deeply intertwined, and untangling them would be a huge undertaking.
So it sounds like we're talking about a lot more than just handing off a stack of files.
Exactly. And there's more. The department also plays a vital role in collecting and analyzing data about education across the country.
Okay, tell me more about that. What kind of data are we talking about, and what do they actually do with it?
One big example is tracking student outcomes, like how well students are performing in different subjects. Recently, the department has been highlighting some worrying trends in reading scores based on something called the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP. It's a nationwide test given to students in different grades to gauge their reading levels.
So the NAEP is showing that reading literacy is declining, and the Department of Education is the one sounding the alarm on this trend.
Exactly. And this data is crucial. Without it, we wouldn't have a clear picture of how students are doing on a national level.
So individual states might collect their own data, but the department is the one pulling it all together and looking at the bigger picture.
Right. And they don't just collect data. They also fund a ton of research through their research arm, the Institute of Education Sciences, or IES. They study everything from how to improve teacher quality to what kinds of interventions work best in the classroom.
So they're supporting the research that helps us understand how to make education better for everyone.
Exactly. It's all about finding what works and making sure those best practices are shared and implemented across the country. And then there's another critical function, overseeing schools and colleges when it comes to civil rights.
Civil rights in education. Okay, that sounds super important, but honestly a little vague. What does that actually look like in practice?
Well, that's where the Office for Civil Rights, or OCR, comes in. They investigate complaints of discrimination in schools,
Right,
from
so
kindergarten all the way up through college.
So if a student feels like they've been discriminated against because of, say, their race, religion, gender, disability, or any other protected characteristic, they can file a complaint with the OCR.
Exactly. And the OCR has some real power. They can launch investigations. And if they find that a school has violated someone's civil rights, they can actually force them to make changes. They can even withhold federal funding.
Wow, so they can really hold schools accountable. Can you give me an example of a case they might handle?
Sure. Just recently, they resolved a case involving allegations of anti-Palestinian discrimination on a college campus. They investigated, found that there was evidence of discrimination, and worked with the college to implement changes to their policies and procedures, to prevent that kind of discrimination from happening again.
So they're not just sitting in an office somewhere. They're actively going out there and making sure that students' rights are protected.
Right. And the number of complaints they handle is huge. In fiscal year 2024, the OCR received over 22,000 complaints, and they're projecting over 23,000 in 2025. The majority of these involve sex-based or disability-based discrimination.
Wow, okay, so the OCR is a busy office. Okay, so we've talked about the Department of Education's role in managing student loans, providing grants to schools, supporting research, collecting data, and enforcing civil rights. That's a lot. But some people still want to get rid of it entirely. Why is that?
Well, it's complicated, but a lot of the arguments come down to this idea that education should be handled at the state and local level, not by the federal government.
Right, we talked about that earlier with Trump's send education back to the states idea.
Yeah.
But what are the specific arguments? Why do they think states would do a better job than the federal government?
One argument is that a smaller federal role would mean less bureaucracy and red tape for schools. States would have more flexibility to design their own education systems and tailor them to their specific needs.
So instead of a one-size-fits-all approach from Washington, you'd have 50 different states, each with its own unique approach to education.
Exactly. Proponents of this view argued that this would lead to more innovation and experimentation as states compete with each other to come up with the best ways to educate their students. They also often point to the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, which reserves powers not specifically given to the federal government, to the states or the people.
Ah, the 10th Amendment. That's
Yeah.
the one that often comes up in debates about states' rights versus federal power.
Right. People who want to dismantle the Department of Education see it as a classic example of federal overreach, like the federal government sticking its nose into something that should be left to the states.
So they believe that education is one of those areas that the Constitution intended to leave primarily to the states. And then, of course, there's the issue of cost.
Yeah, dismantling the department would eliminate its administrative expenses, which could potentially save taxpayer dollars.
Okay, so less bureaucracy, more state control, and potentially lower costs. Those are some pretty strong arguments. But I imagine there are also some strong arguments against dismantling the department, right?
Absolutely. Opponents of dismantling argue that those potential savings in administrative costs would be outweighed by losses in efficiency and effectiveness. They point to the department's role in ensuring equity and accountability, arguing that a strong federal presence is needed to protect the rights of all students, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds.
That makes sense.
Hmm.
We were just talking about the Office of Civil Rights and the work they do to combat discrimination. Would that work be as effective if it were left to individual states?
That's a big concern for people who oppose dismantling the department. They worry that without a strong federal presence, some states might not be as vigilant in protecting the rights of all students, especially those who are already marginalized or underserved.
But there's a fear that dismantling the department could actually lead to more inequality in education, with some students getting a better education than others simply because of where they live.
Exactly. Opponents also worry about a potential decline in educational quality overall if standards and funding vary widely from state to state. A patchwork system, they argue, could lead to some students receiving a subpar education simply because their state doesn't have the resources or the political will to invest in high-quality schools.
And we can't forget about the impact on research and data collection.
Right. Without a national entity like the Department of Education to coordinate these efforts, we could lose valuable insights into what works in education and how to best support students and teachers. We might see a decline in the quality and availability of research, which could ultimately hurt students in the long run.
So it sounds like there are some valid concerns about what might happen if we lose that national perspective on education.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that this isn't just a theoretical debate. We have real-world examples of what happens when education is left entirely to the states. Some states have made great strides in improving their education systems, while others have lagged behind, leading to significant disparities in educational opportunities and outcomes for students.
Right, so it's not as simple as saying that states will automatically do a better job than the federal government. There's a lot of variation out there. And some states are clearly better equipped than others to handle this responsibility.
It's exactly. And that's why this debate is so complex and important. We're talking about the future of our children, the future of our workforce, and ultimately the future of our country.
Okay, so we've got these two very different perspectives on the role of the federal government in education. On one side, you have people who believe that the Department of Education is too big, too bureaucratic, and too intrusive, and that states should have more control over their own education systems. On the other side, you have people who believe that a strong federal presence is needed to ensure equity, accountability, and quality in education for all students, regardless of where they live.
It's a classic debate about the balance of power between the federal government and the states, and there are strong arguments to be made on both sides. Ultimately, the decision of whether or not to dismantle the Department of Education is a political one. That'll be decided by Congress.
And it's a decision with far-reaching consequences. That will shape the future of education in this country for generations to come.
Absolutely. And as you listen to all of this, I'm curious, what are your thoughts? What stands out to you? Are there any points that you find particularly surprising or compelling?
You know, one thing that really struck me is just how much the Department of Education actually does. I think a lot of people, myself included, tend to just focus on the student loan aspect, but it's so much more than that.
I agree. The department plays a vital role in so many different aspects of education, from early childhood all the way up through college and beyond. It's easy to overlook the complexity and breadth of its responsibilities until you really start to unpack it.
And when you do unpack it, you realize just how much is at stake in this debate. We're not just talking about administrative structures or budget lines. We're talking about real-world impacts on millions of students and educators across the country.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that education is not just a political issue. It's a human one. At its core, it's about empowering individuals to reach their full potential and contribute to society. And that requires a system that is equitable, accessible, and responsive to the needs of all learners.
I couldn't agree more. And as we move into the final part of this deep dive, I'm curious to explore some alternative perspectives. While the idea of completely dismantling the Department of Education is certainly out there, there are other, perhaps more nuanced approaches to reforming the federal role in education. So far we've mostly been talking about two extremes, right? Either keeping the Department of Education as it is, or completely getting rid of it. Are there any other options out there? Like, what about something in between?
Oh yeah, there are definitely some middle ground approaches being discussed. One idea is to restructure the department or streamline it, make it more efficient and focused.
Okay, so not a total demolition, more like a renovation. What would that actually look like?
We'll imagine a more decentralized model where the department sets, broad national goals and provides support to states, but gives them more flexibility in how they achieve those goals.
I see. So instead of dictating every detail from Washington, the department would be more like a guide or advisor, working collaboratively with states to improve education.
Exactly. Think of it like a coach. They provide guidance and resources, but ultimately empower the players on the field to make the decisions.
I like that analogy. And this approach might address some of those concerns about federal overreach, but still maintain a role for the federal government in ensuring equity and accountability.
Right. Another idea that's been floating around is shifting some of the department's responsibilities to other agencies, agencies that might have more expertise in specific areas.
So, for example, maybe the Treasury Department could handle student loans, since they already deal with so many financial matters. And maybe the Department of Justice could take on the civil rights enforcement piece. given their focus on legal issues.
Yeah, exactly. It's about finding the right fit for each function, right? Recognizing that the Department of Education, as it stands now, might be trying to do too much.
Hmm. It sounds like these alternative approaches are trying to strike a balance. They're recognizing the need for some federal involvement in education, but also giving states more autonomy and flexibility.
Exactly. There's no easy answer here, and it's important to weigh the potential benefits and drawbacks of each approach. But one thing is clear, we need to move beyond this all or nothing way of thinking about it.
I totally agree. And as we think about these different options, it's so important to remember that education isn't just some political football. It's about people.
Yeah, at its core, it's about empowering individuals to reach their full potential and contribute to society. And that requires a system that's equitable, accessible, and responsive to the needs of all learners.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Mm.
I really want to encourage you to go beyond the headlines and think critically about the role of education in our society.
Yeah, think about it. What values should guide our decisions about education policy? How can we create a system that both nurtures individual potential and promotes the common good?
These are questions that deserve our thoughtful consideration, regardless of our political leanings or personal beliefs.
Because ultimately, the future of education is the future of our nation.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's made you curious and given you some new insights into this super complex and important issue. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep engaging in the conversations that